For decades, the United States and Venezuela have been locked in this really tense relationship. It's a story that's built on a foundation of oil, but it's been fractured by deep ideological divides. So in this explainer, we're going to unravel the threads of this complex history, all the way from Cold War alliances to the power plays we see today. When you see the headlines, all the talk of sanctions, the accusations, the political standoffs, it's easy to wonder if this is something more than just a diplomatic spat. Is the U.S. waging some kind of silent war against Venezuela? It's a heavy question for sure, but it gets right to the heart of this long, complicated struggle.
But here's the thing. This isn't a war in the way we usually think of it. You won't see tanks rolling or jets scrambling. Nope. This is a very 21st century kind of conflict, one that's fought with economic sanctions, with diplomatic pressure, and of course, a nonstop war of words. And really, understanding that difference is the key to getting the whole picture.
So to figure out how we got here, we're going to take a trip back in time, starting with the Cold War roots of this whole thing. Then we'll look at the rise of Hugo Chavez and the huge role that oil plays. After that, we'll dive into the era of sanctions and the geopolitical chessboard as it looks today. And finally, we'll look ahead and ask that big question, what's next?
All right, so our story really kicks off in the shadow of the Cold War. This was a time of intense global competition, right? Communism versus capitalism. And it was in this environment that the initial relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela was really forged. For a big chunk of the 20th century, the U.S. and Venezuela were actually pretty tight. Washington saw Caracas as a stable democratic partner, a reliable source of oil, and a key ally against the spread of communism in Latin America. The relationship was so solid that even when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in '76, they stayed close trading partners. But then, come the 1980s, things started to fall apart. A huge economic crisis, driven by falling oil prices and massive debt, created a ton of social unrest, and that basically set the stage for a political earthquake.
And rising from the turmoil of that economic crisis was a figure who would completely change the course of Venezuelan history: Hugo Chavez. He was a charismatic and definitely controversial leader. And his rise to power, combined with Venezuela's incredible oil wealth, would completely redefine the country's relationship with the United States.
Look, to understand Venezuela, you first have to understand oil. It's that simple. The country is sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the entire planet. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Iran. This unbelievable natural resource has been both a huge blessing and, in some ways, a curse. It's fueled the country's economy, but also made it a major piece on the global geopolitical chessboard. Once Chavez was in power, the whole dynamic with the U.S. just got flipped on its head. The days of quiet cooperation? Gone. Chavez was a self-proclaimed socialist revolutionary, and he launched this fierce critique of what he called American imperialism. He then used Venezuela's oil money to fund social programs and build a coalition of leftist governments across Latin America, really trying to create a new power bloc to challenge U.S. influence in the region.
As many analysts have pointed out, the rise of Chavez was seen as a direct challenge to U.S. influence in a region it had long considered its own backyard. The rules of the game had totally changed, and a new, much more confrontational era had begun.
So, faced with this new challenge right in its own hemisphere, the United States turned to one of its most powerful tools: economic sanctions. This really kicked off a new phase in the conflict, one that wasn't fought with weapons, but with bank accounts and financial markets. So, what exactly are economic sanctions? Well, you can kind of think of them as a financial quarantine. The idea is to isolate a country from the global economic system, making it really hard for them to do business, to trade, or to borrow money. It's a way to put immense pressure on a government without having to resort to military action.
The U.S. sanctions against Venezuela were really designed to hit the country where it would hurt them most: its oil industry. That's the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy. The hope in Washington was that by cutting off that revenue, they could essentially starve the government of cash and force political change.
But here's the million-dollar question. Did the sanctions actually work? Well, it's a huge debate. On one side, you have critics who say the sanctions absolutely crippled Venezuela's economy and caused terrible suffering for ordinary people. On the other side, supporters argue that the country's economic collapse was caused by years of government mismanagement before the toughest sanctions hit. It's a classic chicken and egg argument, and honestly, there are no easy answers.
But this whole story is no longer just a two-player game. In the last several years, other major players have stepped onto the field, turning what was a regional dispute into a much larger global contest for influence. See, as the U.S. has tightened the economic screws on Venezuela, other global powers have seen an opportunity. Russia, China, and Iran have all stepped in to offer support to the Venezuelan government, whether it's military, financial, or in the energy sector. This has turned Venezuela into a real flashpoint in a much broader global rivalry.
The result of all this is a kind of geopolitical tug-of-war. You've got the U.S. and its allies on one side, and Venezuela and its international backers on the other. Both sides are pulling as hard as they can, but neither seems able to gain a clear upper hand. And the country is just locked in this diplomatic stalemate, with the Venezuelan people stuck right in the middle of it all.
So, where do we go from here? I mean, after all these decades of tension and conflict, the U.S. and Venezuela are at a crossroads. Is it going to be more of the same confrontation, or is there a path to step back from the brink?
When you boil it all down, this is a story about power, resources, and influence. The faces might change and the tactics might evolve, but the core struggle is still there. The U.S.-Venezuela conflict is a powerful reminder that in geopolitics, interests are what drive everything.
The relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela is this incredibly complex, constantly shifting puzzle. With so many different pieces in play, it's pretty much impossible to say for sure what the future holds. But one thing is certain, the whole world is watching. So, what do you think the next move will be in this high-stakes game of geopolitical chess?